Well, I've been given the honor of introducing my old friend and colleague, Steve Porges. I first met Steve in the late 80s, and Paul, Lara, and I kind of realized there was somebody that knew something about heart rate variability, and we didn't. And we were just starting out, but that was the beginning of our journey in heart rate variability. We realized that it was a very tricky technical area, but Steve had mastered it, and we were thrilled to work with him in that way. His early work with neonates was very impressive, and it's gone on from there. And led us eventually, to HRV and then to HRV biofeedback. His 95 paper, where do I push the button? Nope. Sorry, which button do I push? No, one more, next slide. That's the book. There's a plug for the book. Had to put that up. One more slide. This paper changed my research and clinical life. It should be a most cited paper in our field. I don't think it is, but the idea of vagal withdrawal as an alternative to sympathetic activation changed everything I thought about in psychophysiology and eventually in biofeedback. And if you you can get the flavor for this paper and others by looking and reading this book and other kinds of things. In addition to the scientific stuff, I've been fortunate enough to have a long, rewarding relationship with Steve and Sue, and even his kids a little bit. Our wives bonded over Chicos, enjoyed many lovely meals and laughs together. We used to go to a Greek restaurant in Chicago whenever we visited him in Chicago. That was a highlight of our trip, get away from my relatives and go see Steve and Sue. I won't use this time to describe his accomplishments and career because it would take the whole time. I'll just say that if you Google him on Google Scholar, prepare to spend a couple days reading papers that are wonderful that go on and on. Currently, he's a distinguished professor at Indiana University and at the University of North Carolina, and the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium. And for those of us who have been wondering about trying to integrate bottom-up and top-up physiology, he's our great hero and our hope for the future that other people will finally get what's going on. More formally, tonight I'm honored to give him the distinct honor of the award of the 2023 AAPB Distinguished Scientist Award. You can come on up, Steve. The AP Scientist Award is presented annually. And the awards presented annually to someone who's achieved recognition in biofeedback and psychophysiology among peers and among people in the field. And Steve really set this whole field going, and he's very deserving of the award. And I'm so happy to present it to him.
Thank you.
It's heavy.
Don't want to drop. Listen, you get the hug. Thank you. Thank you, Dick. Thanks for the kind words. Well, yeah, thank you very much. I can't really top what Fred did, so maybe I should just make this a very short talk. Let's get this first slide up to make sure that we're synced. Oh, I have to return my machine on. I went to sleep. Excuse me for a second. Okay, we are on. Anyway, thank you very much for honoring me and inviting me to talk. I was quite surprised because, first of all, I've tracked biofeedback from the very beginning, actually before there was any society. And part of my talk really is about the history of biofeedback as well as the history of psychophysiology. And as we stand up, as I'm going to basically say, the interesting comments about getting older. I've had a couple discussions while I've been here, and that is, I've asked my more mature colleagues here how they were dealing in a world of younger people, meaning within academic settings. And they said, with older people, they just talk about the past. And I'm going to basically say, I'm going to talk about the past, but I feel privileged because I am an older person. But this whole personal journey, and the title of the talk is the same as the title of the paper that I did for a special issue that Paul edited for the journal. And it was really about the history of heart rate variability through my own eyes. And I'm going to kind of take you on this history from the day I walked into graduate school in 1966. That's a long time ago. I want to put this in perspective. And some of you, a very few of you, were at a meeting in Boston. It was a biofeedback meeting. I'm not even sure what the group was called then. I think it was 73 or 1974. And Edmund Jacobson talked. And what did he talk about? He talked about being a student in William James's classes. And I'm sitting back in this, I'm like 27 or 28 then, something like that. And I'm looking at this guy. And I'm saying, wow, he's standing up. He doesn't need help standing up, and he's talking. This is great. Now, there were other people in the meeting who were saying, oh, nothing new. I'm saying, this is amazing. I'm seeing the world through someone who knew William James. And this, to me, was a touch of the moment. It was very special. And now look where we are, look where I am. And I'm now standing. I'm going to be talking for an hour without help. And you're going to look, and there'll be two different views. One will be the view of, well, what an interesting life to have lived. And the other view will be, wow, he was able to give a talk for an hour. And it was cogent, at least I think or hope it will be. Anyway, it's interesting how our perspectives change when we mature. And I use the word mature. And we start learning that maturation is kind of a true individual difference. Some of us maintain a type of vitality. Some of us are, as I use the term, being blessed with reasonable health. And others we have waved goodbye to unexpectedly. It's really a experience that when you live through it, you have a sense of what it means to have gratitude. And gratitude is really what this evening is about. It's about being able to be with you, to be accessible to you, and to, in a sense, set the model. What is a scientist who accomplishes anything? What is he or she, unless she's accessible to basically the constituency, you? So accessibility has to become what we, defining a feature of who we are. Okay, so let's go through my life. This is quick. Fall of 1966, I entered this amazing large campus of one of these, it's Michigan State University, and coming from the East Coast, literally coming from outside of Exit 9 on the New Jersey Turnpike for those who are East Coast people. The community was called Highland Park. It was outside of New Brunswick. And East Coast people see the world a little differently. I really had never been west of where was it, the furthest west? I was in Chicago for a weekend. But going to Michigan State was the first time I really had gone really west of Philadelphia in terms of interacting with other people. And what were they? They were optimistic. They didn't understand cynicism. I had no idea what this was about. I mean, if I said things, they took it literally. But this was this beautiful campus with smiling people, upbeat people. And it was a big program in psychology. And my perspective was that psychology was, quote, etched into the marble of the great disciplines. I had forgotten, of course, being in my 20s, that psychology was a new discipline, that many of my professors had actually come from the Department of Philosophy, because it used to be the Department of Philosophy and Psychology. So our perspective of continuity is really biased. I think in that paper talked about it as like being born a second child, and I was a second child. And basically, you are born into a family structure that you think was always that way. And that's how it was going to grad school in psychology, because I assumed that psychology was like chemistry, like physics. It was basically there. And this is the building the psych department inherited. It's called Olds Hall, Olds from Oldsmobile. This was Michigan State, outside of Lansing, where they made Oldsmobiles. And it was not originally a psychology building, it was something else. but it was the psych building when I was there. And you'll see pictures because I taught lab courses in that building. And this is me, not in that building, but in another building, a small, new, innovative building that they had built called the Psychology Research Building, the future. And this is where biological psychology, in a sense, the roots of neuroscience, was starting to emerge. And there I was learning from, actually, my professor was Glenn Hatton, and he was functionally a neurophysiologist. I learned how to make electrodes, how to stimulate brains. I learned how to do perfusions. It was really kind of an intensive 3-term course of laboratories to basically get this skill set, of which I then decided I certainly wasn't going to become a physiological psychologist. I also taught Pigeon Lab, and this became another interesting thing because as we talk about biofeedback in a few minutes, this is Skinnerian, a worldview of operant control. And remember, what year was Miller's famous science paper on operant conditioning of the autonomic nervous system? It was about this period of time, and I was extraordinarily intrigued by it and intrigued about operant technologies. Then, so here's the question. What were the research areas? What were the questions that were going on at the time, the science questions, and what were my interests? Well, my interests were really in feelings, internal states, and that kind of has permeated several of the talks, because when you do biofeedback, the physiological state of your individual client really is going to be a determinant of how well they're going to be receptive or process the biofeedback strategy. But the notion of feelings or internal states, of which really we're talking about autonomic states, was not a viable question. It was not what scientists looked at in psychology. What signals do we broadcast to others? I was interested in that. Why do we feel comfortable in the presence of some, and why do we feel very much distancing? Or why is our body moving from feelings of safety and accessibility to feelings of getting away and threat? So this became, in my work, you can start seeing the roots. So this is like 1960s, but they became the roots of a construct that I developed called neuroception. And neuroception also has roots in orienting defensive reflexes. Basically, it's reflexive responding to signals of safety and threat. Think about that. Embedded in our body are circuits that detect risk and make responses. These are not intentional. They're brain structures that are outside of awareness, that are very rapid, and they're there for a reason. They're there for our survival. So in 1966, there was no discipline that studied these questions. Feelings were not an acceptable field of inquiry. Even emotions were dismissed and framed objectively in studies of motivation. So the Society for the Science of Motivation, their journal was called Motivation and Emotion, and it started in 1977. So even though emotion carries a lot of the dialogue, affective neuroscience even, it was not really a welcomed area in the 60s. And also remember, there's Cartesian dualism in the background, and it's prioritized science into measurable and hopefully unbiased objective measures. That meant feelings were off the table. Now, what would happen if physiology was measured as to represent those subjective feelings? That became an interesting area, interesting question. And there was a discipline that was emerging, and that discipline was called psychophysiology. It presented that possibility of investigating the subjective world with objective measurements. And I was hooked, because now you could tap it and you wouldn't get into that argument. And that was the seduction of using physiology, was to tap into those processes. What you'll hear later is that that is a misdirection. It's a misunderstanding of our physiological feelings. It's a misunderstanding of the parallel between psychological phenomena and physiology. And this is my lab that I was teaching psychophysiology in 1967. My mentor at that point, and who taught the main course, and I taught the lab, was David Raskin. And Raskin was a trained psychophysiologist, which was rare in the late 1960s. And I'm going to show a slide of an ECG. And this really became the metric of understanding heart rate. And how did you measure the time between the R to R intervals, those milliseconds? Well, you used a ruler. Every heartbeat was measured with a ruler. It was a very time-intensive work to actually look at heart rate. And this was David's laboratory, and which had a nice Beckman polygraph. But you see that relay rack with all the wires? All that was doing was turning on some flashing lights and tones. It was nothing very complex, but there were no laboratory computers. They did not exist. Now, what happened, and this was the first big innovation, it was a tachograph. Tachographs displaced the pen on the polygraph paper, on the physiograph, based upon the timing between those R intervals. So now you could measure heart rate, not based, it wouldn't be biased by your paper speed. Before, you had to run the paper speed quite rapidly so that your measurements were precise enough to get millisecond accuracy. And it was very expensive. So the tachograph was this welcome device. And Raskin had one in his laboratory, because what you can see with a tachograph, you're getting displays of what we were later quantifying as heart rate variability. And what we were observing, and this was my master's thesis, and you'll hear about that in a few moments, that those oscillations, what we now call respiratory sinus arrhythmia, were changing when people were engaged in attending. Now, this was also a time period that when you got those R intervals, what could you do with them? Well, you could basically get the mechanical calculator. So on the left is a mechanical calculator. You might find it in some museum, but that was the room that the graduate students had a analysis room, which had basically lots of those mechanical calculators, and they would always break and they get jammed, and people would literally pick them up and bounce them on the table, and the gears would start moving again. And near my end of my graduate school period, they got an LED electronic calculator, no more powerful than the cheapest ones that you get for maybe a couple of dollars now. And you see in the middle, it's pretty large, and that cost $1,000 in 1968. And then if we move to far right, we see this mainframe, this large computer. And the large computer is where you had to get your data to process if you want to look at variables like heart rate variability and do analysis of variance. And basically what you had, and what you can see in this picture on the far left, are people who are punching cards. And there's a card punch, which these used to be called IBM data cards. And what you can see is that not only did you punch the data into the card, but another person took the same notebook and punched it again into the same card to see if it matched. And if it matched, it got a verification mark. And then you got a tray of cards, and you would then go over to the computer center, get in line with your primitive programming that you learned from, this is even before SAS, and I'm not even sure what we were using, how to learn a little bit of Fortran. You basically create format cards and a little primitive programming to call some analysis routines, and you give it to a technician, and they basically stack it up, and then you're told to come back in 3 days. And you come back in 3 days, and if you're lucky, you get a printout. If you're not lucky, you get a very small printout that says error, which meant that something was wrong. It could be like your format card was off, and you're back in that process. And many people literally had great delays in their dissertations because they couldn't get their data analysis. So it was a very anxious or anxiety-producing procedure. So this is this new emerging discipline. It was called psychophysiology. The society, again, now we start getting into the history. It was founded in 1966, and the journal came out, the first issue was 1964. And I started grad school in 66. And that was the journal of my peer group. It was small. It was a society of about 200 people. And there were 2 edited books on basically methods in psychophysiology. The literature was scant. In a sense, it was almost like you're waiting for the next journal to come out, the expectation, or next textbook. And John Stern, who was a friend, and he was a professor at Wash U in St. Louis, he kind of created certain terminologies and said, what is psychophysiology? He wanted to say it's any research in which the dependent variable is a physiological response and the independent variable is a psychological or behavioral one. So he was basically trying to create this template of what it is to study psychophysiology. Of course, they had much greater flexibility over time. By 1972, my research complemented this basic stimulus response model by emphasizing that autonomic state, which was being measured by heart rate variability, was an intervening variable in now created this stimulus organismic state response variable. So it was no longer a cause and effect. It was a mediational model, even though we didn't even know what that word meant. But the issue was the physiology, the autonomic state of the individual was a mediator of even if about their heart rate reactivity to external stimuli. And when I started to write about that, people really didn't know what to make of it because they said, how can you measure heart rate variability? To them, it was measuring heart rate and now make predictions about heart rate responding. They started to argue that it was circular. They also started to argue, and this is really the interesting part, the argument was that heart rate variability was error, that the heart was there literally floating in a visceral sea with a constant beat. And the only reason you got variability was it was responding to external cues. And if you were a crappy researcher, you had heart rate variability because you weren't controlling your setting. And distinguished, even National Academy of Science people were basically arguing that with me. Now, what did that tell me about them? It told me they were extremely naive about the underlying neural mechanisms that produce heart rate variability. So now you know what my next stretch of work was going to be about. So this actually will show you where the first publications of heart rate variability. In fact, in the master's thesis, what is kind of in the little square, the term I used was heart rate variance, not even heart rate variability. And that was my master's thesis. And that showed that heart rate variability changes in it distinguish different types of attention, although respiration didn't. And that became also the big question. And it's even related to biofeedback. And that is, what is the relationship between breathing changes and heart rate variability changes? Still within your discipline, it's a big question. And what I was trying to show was that the respiration patterns were generalized across attention, but the degree of engagement was really being mapped into the heart rate variability. Now, in my dissertation, which was published in 1972, heart rate variability is now in the title, and it was in the title after that point. And this is kind of a list of early studies on heart rate variability that I did. And moving in the early 1970s, when I took a job, my first academic job was at West Virginia University. And what they had for me was access to the newborn nursery. So I had a GRASS polygraph in the nursery. So I was doing studies with newborn babies. And I was so naive because I believed that it was something easy to do. And I didn't realize that very, very few people had even done that, had even tried to measure babies. And the first thing I noticed was that in the literature, behavioral state was not even controlled with the infant literature. They were basically presenting tones and lights and anticipatory conditioning responses, whether the baby was asleep or awake. It didn't matter. And they didn't really care whether the baby was 24 hours old or 3 days. And I went into this very experimental control model of only presenting stimuli when the baby's eyes were open and the baby was awake. And suddenly I was seeing new responses, things that my colleagues said don't exist, meaning don't exist in babies, because they started to hypothesize or assume certain neural regulation didn't occur. And so I was demonstrating that not only could you get so-called orienting or detection responses of lights and sounds, but you can also develop contingencies or temporal conditioning or classical conditioning in newborns. So these were phenomena. And it was really kind of interesting that all those phenomena, conditioning and the orienting type responses, were mediated by the baby's heart rate variability. So if they had more heart rate variability, they were more reactive to the stimuli, and they develop contingencies. So by the 1980s, my research, by focusing on refining and validating metrics sensitive to vagal regulation of the heart, diverged from the original tenet of psychophysiology that treated physiological variables as observables similar to behavior. And this becomes actually a point that is really important in the world of biofeedback, because biofeedback, and especially the work, really landmark and pioneering work of Neil Miller, treated physiology, even in animals, as if it were behavior and could be put under stimulus control. Now, the treatment of physiology of behavior was neurophysiologically naive, and this becomes the important point. So we have this notion there's an intervening variable that was kind of forgotten, the organization of the physiology. And the second thing is now all the work at that time in psychophysiology in the 70s up to the late 70s was really aphysiological, naive about neural mechanisms. It was physiological in terms of measurement, but naive about neuroregulation. And I was asking the question, what are the mechanisms producing these responses? And they led to the vagus. And of course, that's what I still work on. But the issue was, could I develop a metric that was sensitive to that vagal influence? And the neurophysiology, the literature, explained to me that respiratory sinus arrhythmia was that variable. And the job now was, how can you develop a metric that accurately measures this? Why was it a good metric? Because going back to the early 1900s, Herring even noted that the impact of the firing of the vagus on the sinusoidal node only carries a respiratory rhythm. So what we're seeing in respiratory sinus arrhythmia, even over 100 years ago, was known that that rhythm was vagal. So the question now is, with that knowledge, can you now craft a metric that taps into the amplitude of that measure and is not confounded by other influences on that heart rate pattern, which can be complex? So the tenet now remains entrenched. The tenet that physiology acts like behavior is locked into your discipline. And I'm here not to say that your discipline is wrong, but your discipline can make great leaps forward if it refines its measurements to become more neurally sensitive. Then the impact of what you're rewarding or reinforcing or training can now have a more efficient impact on the nervous system. Is there an outcome benefit in biofeedback if a neural orientation and a stimulus organism response model is adopted? That becomes the question where you can do research. And I have in print there is a new patent. I actually have a patent that talks about basically neural metrics, which I know has a history of the term, but neural metrics that are extracted from the heart rate pattern that can be utilized and basically placed under stimulus control. So here's the model. We went from that ECG, we went to the tachograph, we saved money on paper. We could still use our millimeter metric. Heart rate then became heart rate variability. Our colleagues were a little bit confused. How could the same variable be represented in two different metrics? Because they had no neurophysiological model. Then the movement was from descriptive statistics and heart rate variability. In my earlier work was basically started off as measure of variance, moved to log variance, then moved to basically spectral analysis to pull out rhythms, and then developing a real-time algorithm that extracted the amplitude of respiratory sinus arrhythmia, a neural metric. And so methodology became very important in my work. And then validation studies, because how do you validate that one method is better than another? Tough question, because you have to use blockade studies, and sometimes blockades are confusing in themselves. And then I will talk about applications, and later I will actually tell you what the new metrics are that we're still using or still developing. So I had this wonderful collaboration as a young faculty member at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I had a colleague by the name of Bob Bohr, and he was a mathematician. He was an unusual person because he was blind. And our discussions were quite amazing because it was basically a visualization of the world. And even when I would go to his classes and he would try to write on the blackboard, it was really it's almost like having, yeah, basically he'd start on one point and it would just start graduating down. So the class had great difficulty in following. I used to go to his classes to try to understand some of this, and we wrote some chapters and several papers together. This is a list of papers, and in which we basically were building models of how to extract an accurate measure of respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and often used spectral analysis in the beginning. And then I developed a patent based upon that work, which really had literally the ability to have a real-time output of the amplitude respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And we put it in, this is the foolishness of dreams. So what did I do? I got a patent. I created a little company where we had this online real-time vagal tone monitor. And basically, fortunately, didn't lose too much money, but learned a lot about myself. Learned I didn't like to do business. I like to be a scientist, and there are things that we do well, and things that we don't want to do, and we probably don't do so well. But still have a couple of these devices in our garage, and they're kind of historic to me. They were based on the motherboard of the first IBM PC, the 8086 board. The chip, it had no moving parts. Everything was done on an EEPROM, which is a chip. And it basically digitized at 1 kilohertz, which was better than anything out there at the point. It had basically a automatic gain control on the digitizer. It had a lot of innovations, and it basically displayed beat-to-beat heart rate and an RSA over 10-second or 30-second epochs. And I carried it with me to India, where I did some little preliminary work in the early 1990s with some yogas to see what yoga breathing would do to vagal control, and basically found some interesting things. Never wrote up any of it, but it was an interesting journey. And the methodology that we developed in the 80s, and that patent was 1985, it's over now, is still being used in the Brain Body Center at the University of North Carolina, where my colleagues are actually running workshops on basically teaching people how to use that methodology. And this is the new patent, which basically extracts new components or different components of autonomic signals, and they can be applied. The long-term gain would be, can they be used in biofeedback? So early psychophysiology and biofeedback, it treated physiology as a behavior. And early psychophysiology and biofeedback made the assumption that for intentional thoughts to causally influence physiology, they had to be independent of voluntary skeletal motor movement. So this was, quote, the real science. Can we paralyze the body and control the viscera? And this really resulted in a science paper by Neil Miller and his group. And also the view, at least I had heard this as a faculty member, that Miller was being considered for a Nobel Prize based upon this work. But as many of you know, that work failed to replicate, and the phenomenon that they were seeing literally disappeared in subsequent studies. And interestingly, what they found out was that they were using curare, because curare was known as to paralyze striated muscles. But what they didn't realize was that what they were blocking were cholinergic pathways, and the vagus is also cholinergic. So they were knocking out the vagal regulation of the autonomic nervous system, which would make it impossible to do the type of control conditioning that they wanted to display. And interestingly, they noted that the heart rates of their rats were extremely fast because they had blocked the vagus. So there was a lot of understanding coming across. And in background, there were people like Paul Obris, who talked about cardiac somatic coupling, and curare studies that there was a literature by the 1950s documenting that curare impacted greatly on the autonomic nervous system. So the whole issue of the whole let's say, almost the birth of biofeedback was based on a degree of misunderstanding. And of course, the success of biofeedback remains based upon not its separation from striated muscle, but its integration. That the systems, you're tapping into an integrated system that is integrated for an adaptive reason. So the limited knowledge of neuroregulation of the autonomic nervous system and the treatment of HRV as error created kind of a diversion. People didn't know what they were looking at. So they couldn't find compelling reasons to study periodic heart rate activity. That was, I found, really, that was really what I was always talking about. And I was always shocked that not everyone was as interested in it as I was. They assumed that heart rate reflected only the metabolic needs of the organism, a view that evolved prior to the advent of computer-dependent measurement and statistical techniques. So it was seen as being a metabolic output. If you need more metabolic resource, heart rate goes up. If it goes down, it's because you're calming, you don't need it. And in fact, when heart rate was treated as a behavior in the biofeedback, those were the same types of explanations. Theoretical constructs such as homeostasis, instead of emphasizing the range of plasticity of the heart rate response pattern, emphasize the notion of a set points. So they're talking about or constant level. So people were not even understanding the dynamics of what homeostasis really means, which is really oscillating around a set point. And the oscillation for healthy, flexible people is really has quite high amplitudes. And this is across virtually any system you want to study, including movement. The views contribute to a belief that the heart rate pattern reflected a vegetative state of the organism and did not map directly into the neural control of systems mediated by the central nervous system. So in a sense, it is part of a vegetative function and therefore not connected to higher brain structures, nor communicating. Our visceral state was not sending to our brain information. So we kind of summarize this next important point is what I call psychophysiological parallelism. And this goes back literally to even the statement that John Stern made, that we have a psychological or behavioral phenomenon gets mapped out into our physiology. And there was a belief that there's a signature. And many people would say that if we measured enough variables, we'd get that signature. And that was, in a sense, a dream of people who were looking at different emotions and trying to create signatures. And what did they really find? They found that if you're angry, which is metabolically more needy, your sympathetic nervous system really got fired up and your parasympathetic went down. And if you're kind of happy and calm, it's different. It goes the other direction. But the specificity didn't occur. And there are even papers, and this goes into colleagues and good friends, John Cacioppo and Gary Bernson, where they actually articulate a model of psychophysiological parallelisms. And I think this is a false direction because it doesn't look at the nervous system. If we look at our brain, it's an inverted triangle. And the autonomic nervous system is really being regulated by small areas in the brainstem. It doesn't have that much variance. It creates platforms for higher level brain structures to develop emotions, to develop other types of perspectives on the world. So when Ruth talked about Yock Pansep's work with the 7 systems, they're all based on foundational survival mechanisms that are autonomic. So the autonomic nervous system is this core process. And in your world of biofeedback, what are you trying to do? You're trying to enter that core survival system and you're trying to shift it from being in a state of threat to being in a state that supports homeostatic functions, health, growth, and restoration, basically states of feeling calm and safe. So it's this whole notion of this most primitive foundational circuit that your work touches, and that changes even the accessibility of higher brain biofeedback or neurofeedback dealing with things like obsessive thoughts, because the assumption is that the thought patterns are not based upon the primary foundational survival mechanisms of feeling safe or threat. The bottom line is the orientation that we're looking at has to be kind of has to be more hierarchical. And autonomic physiology as behavior, I think, was an interesting concept. And I think we all learned a lot about it. And what we start to really understand now is that there are interactions among different systems, including cardiac somatic ones. And whether or not autonomic physiology follows laws of learning is not really a major issue at this point. So we don't really want to go through this one other than that even the NIMH in the use of research domain criteria, better known as RDoC, is also fostering this notion of parallelism in which it encourages an atheoretical empirical explanation that crosses domains to redefine a psychiatric disorder. So it says you have a disorder, let's get as many variables in different domains and let's create an algorithm, a signature. It's not a theoretical model. The theoretical model should be more focused on nervous system at different levels of organization. And this is really the RDoC. So early psychophysiology was behaviorally biased and physiologically naive. I don't need to go much further on this other than the last statement, and that is the autonomic nervous system as a response model, or SR model, and not its intervening role of the autonomic nervous system as being part of a process being studied, the intervening variable with an emphasis on individual and intra-individual variation. The organismic state becomes critical. Now, in your work, you talk in several of the talks that I attended, it's described really as the feelings of our perceptions of the client. But what you're really asking the question is the client's nervous system accessible, welcoming to your intervention? That's an organismic, that's an intervening variable question. And I mentioned Miller stuff. Okay, so what we're going to do is move from this cause and effect science, which is really where we all came into it, including biofeedback. The idea was, if I can put something in, can I get something out? To a concept that there are intervening variables and trying to identify what those intervening variables are, meaning in more contemporary terminology, what variables are mediating stronger or weaker input-output relationships. And the notion that if we acknowledge that the autonomic nervous system is integrated with other neural related systems in our body, does not preclude an acceptance or use of hierarchical features in building your model. So this is now time to honor those that came before. And I'm not sure how aware you are of the interesting work that was done by Ernst Gellhorn. And it's really quite remarkable. He was writing books on autonomic somatic integration, and he was also trying to talk about, he wrote a paper in Psych Review in 1964 called Motion and Emotion. And I think it's almost time to start rediscovering and literally honoring these people who were dealing with the notion that you can't look at any one part of our body. You need to look at the interaction of how these systems are working. And then, to me, the true hero in background is Walter Hess, who got a Nobel Prize in 1949 for basically the brain's regulation of visceral organs. And I'll read his opening statement from his Nobel Prize speech. A recognized fact that, which goes back to the earliest times, is that every living organism is not the sum of a multitude of unitary processes, but is, by virtue of interrelationships and of higher and lower levels of control, an unbroken unity. Now, I read this, and of course, I loved what he was saying, but I reflected upon what would happen if I wrote that in a grant proposal. It would never get funded. It would be viewed as new age, kinky, not serious science. If I wrote that in an article, it would create the same type of bit. Now, here is this very famous scientist. And the question really is, now, he was a physician as well. Let's ask this question: how much does modern medicine acknowledge the bidirectionality of psychological or mental activity on physiology or organs, and organs' effect on our thought processes? Yet they use terms like comorbidity, that if you have certain diseases, you're going to often have, if you have certain physical disorders, you're going to often have psychological or psychiatric disorders and vice versa. So when we get into the world of trauma, we see this playing out in front of us all the time, because when you deal with individuals who have experienced severe trauma, their autonomic nervous system tends to be retuned, and you see this in their gut. The gut becomes literally the red flag of a body that has been triggered to be in an autonomic state of life threat. So polyvagal theory provided an alternative explanation. It was a strategy to organize the autonomic nervous system reactivity into a hierarchical format in which neurophysiological processes related to basic biological determined survival needs are required to be managed successfully before the higher brain structures are literally given access for problem solving, creativity, and even sociality. Meaning that if our bodies lock into the state of defense, forget cognitive function, forget sociality, forget problem solving. And in your world of biofeedback, when you change people's physiology through your procedures, you start seeing sociality come back, you start seeing certain types of physiological problems dissipating, creativity, problem solving, and whatever terminology you want to use. And we can even go back to Ruth's comments. What you're showing is literally a re-embodiment, and where the nervous system is now being more actively connected, or so the brain is being more actively involved, or higher structure of the brain being more actively involved in the regulation of visceral organs. So the theory emphasizes that autonomic state is an intervening variable. It also, it's derived from the phylogenetic and developmental investigations of the sequence in which the brainstem structures regulating the autonomic nervous system evolve and also develop. So you create this hierarchy. And once you know this hierarchy, it enables you to develop literally a set of hypotheses that are consistent with the rest of neurology. That is, when newer systems, basically higher brain systems are newer and lower brain systems are older. But in the autonomic nervous system, there's also a sequence in which the ventral vagus, the component that produces respiratory sinus rhythmia, is the newest autonomic regulatory circuit. And then when that is removed, it literally gives permission to the next newest, which is the sympathetic, and that enables us to mobilize. So we do transitory blocking or withdrawal of the vagus to enable sympathetic excitation. We do that, it enables us to run or flee. We do this in play, and we do this in performance. But when that fails to get us into safe environments, the metabolically costly demands of the sympathetic nervous system trigger literally a vagal shutting down of everything. And this is the dorsal vagus. And this is where the gut goes, which is primarily regulated by the dorsal vagus. It doesn't mean the dorsal vagus under normal, safe, calm, homeostatic conditions is bad. In fact, it supports our homeostatic function. It just becomes permeable and vulnerable when the newer circuits are literally dismissed. So it explains how autonomic state is optimized during safe social interactions and disrupted during defense. So in my own history, I observed what I call the vagal paradox. And this was in the intensive care unit of newborn babies. And I was confused that babies who didn't have respiratory sinus arrhythmia had tachycardia that was then followed by potentially lethal bradycardia. The heart rate got low and they stopped breathing. And I was confused because I learned that bradycardia and apnea was vagal. So I couldn't understand how the vagus could both be promoting health and resilience with high RSA and then be potentially lethal. And that became the roots of the polyvagal theory, because the answer was relatively quite simple. There were two different branches of the vagus. And once this more protective one was withdrawn, then the tachycardia and sympathetics could do it. And then the baby, being preterm, couldn't maintain that metabolic output, and basically the dorsal vagus went into the bradycardia. The interesting thing about preterm babies it provided this very heuristic opportunity to study the vagal regulation of the heart in an organism that did not have a totally mature ventral vagal pathway. So it was really the true test of the theory before I even had the theory. So I could see that the preterm baby literally came into the world with really more like a reptilian autonomic nervous system. And we'll get to that. This created what then I called the Polyvagal Theory, and this was the first presentation of it. And this was my presidential address at the Society for Psychophysiological Research. And this was the world that it dropped into, a world that basically had seen the autonomic nervous system as being in balance or an antagonistic system. And in part, that view is accurate on many levels, especially in the subdiaphragmatic area. You basically have a balance. And in general, the argument for this was that most organs have inputs from both of them. And the answer is yes. But we have to understand within a hierarchical system, what's keeping the sympathetic and the whole autonomic or vagal system from going into defense. And what we can see is we can actually see in our crude and anatomical depictions of the vagus, we can see that there is two branches, one going to the organs above the diaphragm, and this comes from this area called the ventral vagus or nucleus ambiguus. It's in the brainstem. And the other one coming from a dorsal area of the vagus called the subdiaphragmatic vagus, and that's in the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. But what we want to understand is what's the narrative? Why and how did we get these two vagal neurons or areas? And the answer is really, it's an evolutionary journey to sociality. That when we look in embryology and we look in evolution, we start seeing that there's a ventral movement of cardioinhibitory neurons from the dorsal area, meaning the back of the brainstem, to the ventral area of the brainstem. Now, what's the function of this ventral migration? The function is that the cardioinhibitory vagal neurons now get linked to the nerves that regulate the striated muscles of the face and head. So now species, mammalian species, because they're the only ones that have this linkage, can communicate their physiological state through their facial expressivity, through their vocalizations, and actually even tuning their acoustic sensitivity to intonation. So think about a baby crying and what the mother does to the baby. The mother hears the cry, she has a little threat reaction, then she speaks with this melodic, she's broadcasting physiological signals of safety. And what we start seeing is that with mammals, with social mammals, they got this extremely interesting toolkit. They got the capacity to downregulate threat reactions through this ventral vagal circuit because it wasn't merely the vagus to your viscera, it was the vagus to the muscles of your face and head. And those of you interested in pranayama yoga, you're all interested in breath. It's all related to accessing this ventral vagus through the structures of the facial muscles. And the point is, it enables this, not only this ability to broadcast your own state, but also to intervene and to calm your state by knowing how these systems are interactive and together. And we can look in the brainstem and you can see that there are two different areas of the brainstem where basically those neurons start, and then we can see that they migrate ventrally, and we can even come up with a hierarchical model based on stages of our phylogeny, that the most primitive vertebrates have this unmyelinated dorsal vagus, and what it did was it was really the only neural regulation of the autonomic nervous system. And what it basically did in the primitive vertebrates is it shut them down. If they were under threat, they stopped breathing. No problem. Their brains were very small. And then under stage two, you start seeing this coming in with bony fish. You start seeing mobilized behavior. And now with the sympathetic nervous system, you have a lot of this cardiac somatic integration occurring for mobilization now, increasing or having access to more metabolic output. But in stage three, this myelinated ventral mammalian vagus enables social communication as being part of our procedures or toolkit to maintain homeostasis. So not only does social communication shift our physiological state to be calmer, but when we're calmer, we spontaneously emerge cues of safety to others to create social interactions. So this creates this bidirectionality of what we call co-regulation or attunement. Every discipline has its own word for it, or therapeutic presence, which may be closer to the world that you're in, that where there's a bonding occurring through cues of safety to each other. And this system of social engagement, the striate muscles of the face and head, regulate the muscles of mastication, the muscles of the middle ear, because when the muscles of the middle ear become tense, we can actually extract human voice from background sounds. And when the muscles become loose, which is what happens when we are under threat, because it facilitates the detection of low-frequency predator sounds, then we lose the ability to extract human voice. So if you work in the world of autism, what are the features? The kids are in a state of threat, and they also have great difficulty in understanding auditory verbal instructions. They're not deaf. They can hear sounds. They're very sensitive to low-frequency sounds, but their nervous system is tuned to detect predator. Facial muscles, expressivity, again, you can look at autistic kids, or you can look at survivors of trauma. The face goes flat, and it's not a voluntary response. It's really reflecting now autonomic state. They're broadcasting their physiological state. And the most clearest projection of autonomic state comes through laryngeal and pharyngeal nerves, because those nerves are vagal as well, but they're not vagal from your heart. They're vagal to laryngeal and larynx and pharynx. And the intonation of her voice is a good non-invasive indicator of our physiological state. And the intonation of her voice, especially in mothers, and this is a study we actually did, the babies were in what's called a still face procedure, which is the mother plays with the babies for a couple minutes and then freezes her face. The baby reacts to that, often gets very destabilized, and then the mother re-engages. Now, the effect of the mother's vocalizations during engagement was linearly related to whether or not the heart rate was reduced during the engagement, or the distress behaviors were reduced. If the mother's voices were did not have much intonation, no effect on the baby's heart rate. It didn't calm them. No effect in terms of distress behaviors. But if the mother's voices were melodic, heart rate went down over 10 beats per minute within a few seconds, and distress behaviors disappeared. And the other part of this figure is really to emphasize that the bronchi and the heart are related to the same system. And this is really, in the world of biofeedback, bronchi and the heart are critical, especially in heart rate variability feedback. So we can summarize this kind of notion is that we have a face-heart connection. At birth, mammals have this bidirectional neural communication between the face and the heart, creating suck, swallow, breathe, and vocalize. And it forms the core of what I call a social engagement system. Metabolic demands, perceived danger, life-threatening illness, retract the social engagement system, resulting in a face that is not social in a physiological state, removal of this vagal brake. So the social engagement system functionally choreographs the sympathetic and the dorsal vagal complex to create a type of autonomic balance that supports health, growth, and restoration, or what we would call homeostatic functions. I want to I want to move on because we're really going late. So basically the theory says we have these three different states. We detect information from the environment through a process that I call neuroception, which is detection of signals of safety or threat, or basically risk. And the nervous system does this reflexively and interprets it as safety. And if we respond from cues of safety and we feel safe, we spontaneously engage another. We make good eye contact, facial expressivity, and good voice. And if we detect danger, we become more mobilized. And if we detect a life threat, we kind of shut down. Now, there are two other important concepts that we have to emphasize. One is that there's a hierarchical nature here, and that is newer circuits inhibit older ones. And this ventral vagus is newer than the sympathetics, and the sympathetics are newer than the dorsal vagus. So if you have people who have trauma histories, what you'll find out is that they will not have that ventral vagus as the choreographer, the container, or the restrainer of the rest. They might be very mobilized in various states of fight flight, and then shift out of that and become basically shutting down. And if you start talking about, like, if you're interested in gut problems, you see it the same way. You see that when people are going to be constipated, and then they're going to have diarrhea. And this becomes the feature of a system moving back and forth from sympathetic to that dorsal vagus, not being regulated by the ventral vagus. And interestingly, if you work with people with trauma histories, often they try to maintain their lifestyle within a sympathetic world. They try to keep continually active, because if they're continually active, they can't shut down. So the hierarchy is an important model. And then we want to really introduce this important concept called dissolution. And this was introduced in the late 1980s by John Hewlings Jackson. And I believe his grandson was a member of your society. And one time I was at a meeting, he came up to me and was really happy I was talking about his grandfather. But Jacksonian principles of dissolution give us the motivation and really the insight to realize that when newer circuits are damaged or inhibited, older circuits rise in their ability to regulate. And that became literally the cipher of understanding how the autonomic nervous system worked. The hierarchical nature as it gets through dissolution, so that Jacksonian principle plays out. It's playing back in terms of the clinics that you're in. Now we're going to go back in time for a moment to 1972. And I want to see a raise of hands. Have any of you seen this television show? It was called, the initial TV show was called The Probe. And that pilot, and then they tried to release it, they found out that they couldn't use that term, so they called it In Search. Has anyone ever seen this one? I want you to look at what this is about. The guy is wearing, they had agents that wore a medallion or a tie tack or a ring. And what does that look like to you folks? It's a photoplethysmograph. And what they were doing was getting information. Their secret agents had something wired into their head, and they had something like a Houston, like with NASA, station, getting all this information with big computers, interpreting what someone else in that room was feeling. And they're using this for their agents. So they're detecting the voice, the intonation of the voice, and the heartbeat, and they're giving it back to the agent. I was always intrigued with that, and I want to show you something, because a few years ago, we developed something that we call a physiocam. And what the physiocam does, it uses basically a camera to measure from a distance people's heart rate with enough accuracy that you can measure. It basically is a visual imaging of a photoplethysmograph. And it's accurate enough, and I'll show you really how accurate it is with the right algorithms. But this is actually a demo. This is my colleague, and he was my student then, but he's my colleague now at Indiana. And he is the co-inventor and co-patent holder on this device. And what you can see is his heart rate's pretty high for a young guy. But what we were getting off the heart rate waves, we're also making an estimate of respiration from the RSA periodicity. So all we're measuring is basically dynamic blood flow to the face. And this is really the data. On the far left is the regression line for beat-to-beat IBIs versus the visual pulses. The middle figure is now doing it over 2 seconds, and the far right one is now over 5 seconds. So as you average it, you get more, you get closer, but we're still well over 0.95 or something like that in terms of the correlation. It's a very good estimate, and this was the patent. And this is a startup company is using it for clinicians so they can monitor their patients and the ball changes color. It says, uh, I haven't seen it in action. I'm going to look for that. So I'm actually going to take a few more minutes if I get the pleasure of doing that. Is that right? Because I want to talk about the future. And the future is really in the metrics that we all use. So I want to bring you back to the fact that when you use, this is a study that I did back when I was at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and we basically compared various forms of RSA calculations on and off partial blockade. And we had a saline condition, and then we had a glycopyrrate, which is a partial blockade. We used a clinical dose. We did it in the Clinical Research Center. The point I want to show you is the lower right one is with the metric that I developed. The top one is basically using spectral. The one on the bottom left is peak to trough, and the one above that is just heart period itself. Now, if you merely kind of calculate size of effect, you can start seeing the power, the differential power of the methodology we developed, because it lines more tightly with the neural mechanism than the others. And you can see high frequency, peak to trough, and high frequency. And the point is that there's several procedures involved in the method I developed, which has to do with getting rid of certain trends and baseline activity. So you're only looking at the amplitude of RSA. And then also using a log transform to deal with the distributional features of variance. So it's very well designed as a technology to be very acute in of detecting neuroregulation. I want to, since I was listening to talks here, I wanted to basically resurrect another variable that I developed in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And that variable was called weighted coherence. And this is really a paper done in 1986 showing the dashed line is showing, again, the dose response curve, various levels of atropine, showing this really the percentage of variance in the analysis variance design accounted for by the treatment. And you can see that it's certainly better with the measure of RSA than it is for heart period. But I want to bring you to the last variable, which is weighted coherence, which is the coupling between respiration and heart rate. And this is basically a cardiac somatic coupling issue. And this is unaffected by atropine. And what does that tell us? It tells us that it is a brainstem phenomenon. And I am really wondering, in terms of your work on resonance, whether if you look at data on this coherence between breathing and RSA, whether that would be helpful as a mediating variable. The second variable is a variable that I'm using a lot now, and it's called vagal efficiency. And we were using it in a sense across different posture challenges, so supine, sitting, and standing, which really extends the range of heart rate, and looking at the regression line of RSA within that using short periods of time, epochs of 10, 15-second epochs. And my methodology does enable very rapid short samples with reasonable reliability. It also enables now the dynamics. Now, when you go into spectral analysis, there's an assumption that it's stationary, but what we're doing in this is violating stationarity because we want to see that system dynamically adjust. Now, the other part of interest is that we've also, when you start seeing what comes out, like you find people who are tightly coupled, which have very nice linear relationships, and those that are not coupled. But if you're tightly coupled, it means it doesn't matter where on that continuum you're looking, you'll get a good estimate of that vagal efficiency, which is the slope of the curve, which is really telling you for any standardized unit of this metric, how much heart rate are you getting? How many, in this case, it's heart period, how many milliseconds are changing? So with one log unit in the right, you're getting 87 milliseconds of change, but in the one that's more dispersed with the lower slope, you're only getting 14 milliseconds. Now, this variable also is unaffected by basal partial blockade, while RSA and heart period are systematically. Now, when I did research, I also tried various doses of alcohol. Alcohol affects it. And we're working with kids who have functional GI, gut problems. And there was a subset that we found that was hypermobility syndrome, or often Ehlers-Danlos hypermobility. And basically, we could literally diagnose these individuals based upon their vagal efficiency. So if their vagal efficiency was low, we could actually, it was over 75% probability of detection. And they're often basically assumed to have dysautonomia. And I'm starting to think that vagal efficiency is that objective metric into this vague, diffuse variable called dysautonomia, and also linked to many, let's say, functional neurological and functional gastrointestinal disorders. And here's another group. We looked at cyclic vomiting, another group within the GI group. They also had noticeably lower vagal efficiency. And we did a study with individuals, college students who had trauma histories. And we could also look at them during an exercise spike, which creates a dynamic challenge. And you can see that there's individual difference between these. Some individuals had very tight linear coupling and some didn't. And when we look at the distributions of vagal efficiency, we see that if they had a maltreatment history, not reaching post-traumatic stress disorder, they're pushed to the left. And if they had not, they're pushed over to the right with greater vagal efficiency. And what we found also is that that vagal efficiency mediated the impact of their adversity history on their mental health. Now, to really close, we need to kind of come up with where these visions and dreams come from. This is a picture of me in the Royal Museum in London. And this is the Rosetta Stone. And I said, I have to have a picture of that, because really, what is life about but trying to decode secrets? And the Rosetta Stone to me became kind of this metaphor of what my whole life's goal was about. So to me, polyvagal theory is really a way of deconstructing and understanding secrets. Now, when you start your journey, do you start it alone, or do you start with is it shared? And this happens to be a picture of Sue and me the week we met. And this is a picture of us in Orlando early. This is our two kids. They're a lot older now, and here in Orlando. And this is a picture of the three active scientists in our family. This is me, Sue, and Eric, who's in the back row somewhere. And Eric is now a little bit older and a little bit more mature. And he is also working on vagal nerve stimulation, among other things. He does a lot of brain imaging, but he's also created with his colleagues a unit that uses closed loop feedback using auricular stimulation of the vagus to deal with PTSD symptoms. This device may have a future in types of biofeedback modeling, because in his world, what they're using it for is the body is sending the signal back. I should say they're monitoring heart rate variability, basically RSA, and that is determining whether or not the person's getting more or less stimulation. Now, we do have another son, and this son is a film director, and I would basically recommend more entertaining than any of the talks you've heard today or have heard at the meeting would be to watch his movie called Class Action Park. It's about a amusement water park that I took both sons to when they were young, but it has a special history. 7 people died there, and Seth, as a filmmaker, made a movie about it. It's really quite a remarkable movie. It's extremely entertaining. It got a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes film critics. So if you know anything about that. Now, the park was called Action Park, and the movie's called Class Action Park because of a lot of suits. Now, Seth is not merely the director of movies. He's also a polyvagal author and orator. So he and I wrote a book called Our Polyvagal World, How Safety and Trauma Change Us. It's coming out in September, and the picture on the right is Seth giving a talk on polyvagal theory, which everyone said was much more understandable and accessible than anything I could do. So I acknowledge that. So in moving on, Sometimes you've seen the people who have shared the world with me and our shared journey. And sometimes there are obstacles. And this is really from my trip to India. You just don't get on the same path when an ox is looking at you. And sometimes this is being kind of stuck at the airport, not the airport, the train station in Calcutta, basically feeling totally in a different space. And sometimes things are extremely successful. This is me in graduate school when I could really hit the ball. Sometimes you do well on that. And this is kind of a life's journey. And it's talking about the past, but also a little about the future. And I want to mention to you, if you're interested in joining our Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, we are learning about what therapists are doing with survivors of trauma. We're doing survey work, and we'd like to encourage people to help us on that, to become part of that. And if you want more information about my work or the Polyvagal Institute, which is the not-for-profit foundation that we've created to basically encourage collaboration, exploration, and literally creativity of how polyvagal theory can be used. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Porges. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. I know y'all are hungry. I know you'd love to go next door and start the reception. So we'll entertain one question. First hand I see. But then I'm going to let you all stalk him in the reception where he'll be for the next how many hours. So with that, any questions? All right, let's give him another big hand and let's get to the party.